In the winter of 1944, the Waffen-SS advanced through the Ardennes, seeking to break through the Western Front and buy time that the Reich no longer had. On the other side, exhausted, scattered, and on the move, American units had to turn, resist, and regroup under extreme pressure. What followed was not a single battle, but a series of clashes that changed the course of history. Columns of tanks at snowy crossroads, armored vehicles immobilized by lack of fuel, towns transformed into strongholds, and skies that, as they cleared, altered the course of everything. There were rapid advances and silent retreats, decisions made at night and forced abandonments at dawn. When the front closed again, nothing remained intact, neither the units that advanced nor those that held out, nor the balance that had allowed the last German gamble in the West to change the course of the war. The last offensive of the Third Reich. Attacking the Ardennes forest in Belgium was not merely a military calculation, it was a political decision made when all other options had been exhausted. By the end of 1944, Germany was fighting a retreat on all fronts. To the east, the Red Army was advancing with overwhelming material superiority. To the west, the Allies had already crossed France and were pressing toward the Rhine. In that context, Adolf Hitler opted for a coup that did not seek to balance forces but to force a break in the war. The choice of the Ardennes was based on a dual logic. Militarily, the sector offered lighter Allied defences, secondary roads, and wooded terrain that limited the immediate use of air power. Politically, it promised something more ambitious: to break the enemy coalition. If the advance reached the Meuse and separated the British and Canadian forces in the north from the American forces in the south, the Western Front would be divided. Such a split, even if temporary, could generate a crisis of command, tensions among the Allies, and in the best-case scenario, open the door to negotiations from a less unfavorable position. This political objective dictated a specific form of warfare. The offensive was designed as a rigid sequence of points, not as a broad territorial conquest. The corridor between Monschau and Echternach had to be breached within hours. Then, in the towns of Losheim-Graben and Büllingen, the necessary fuel for the King Tiger and Panther tanks to continue their advance would be secured. Stavelot and Trois Ponts, with their bridges over the Amblève River, were technical thresholds. Without them, the heavy advance would be bogged down in impossible detours. Every name on the map had an associated schedule and estimated time frame. There was no margin for error, and the SS, Hitler's best forces, were obliged to meet their objectives. The December weather wasn't a side benefit, it was part of the plan. Low clouds and persistent fog meant days without Allied air support. Every day of overcast skies meant kilometers gained and fewer columns destroyed en route. That is why the SS were placed at the front. Not to hold positions, but to buy time between numbered crosses, even while leaving flanks open and pockets uncleaned. The fragility of the plan was implicit. It depended on capturing enemy depots, on the bridges falling intact, and on the bad weather persisting. But politically, there was no alternative that even came close to a comparable chance. The offensive did not promise total victory, it promised to interrupt the defeat, change the rhythm, and force the enemy to react under pressure. This connects to what follows: the SS advance with precise objectives and an excessive political agenda. When one of these objectives resists longer than expected or is lost by mere minutes, the offensive doesn't stop immediately, but it begins to unravel. The war that follows is a race conditioned by specific locations and by a decision made at the pinnacle of power, where every kilometer gained or lost weighs as much on the map as on the political table. The SS assembled for the attack. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was placed at the forefront of the attack. It was the elite, the best, and above all it retained something the Reich had lost on almost every front: the capacity for immediate impact. It wasn't an intact division, but rather a restructured one built with absolute priority. Its combat groups were built around medium and heavy armored vehicles, with mechanized infantry integrated from the outset, not as later support. The assigned objective was clear and admitted no interpretations: open the main axis, advance without stopping, and reach the intersections that would allow other forces to follow. Joachim Peiper was placed at the head of this effort, not because of formal hierarchy, but because his profile fit the mission. Peiper was accustomed to operating autonomously, making quick decisions, and applying pressure without waiting for consolidation. Under his command, the Leibstandarte concentrated panthers for sustained advances and King Tigers from the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion as a breakthrough element. These were new or recently refurbished tanks with frontal armor virtually impervious to standard Allied weaponry and an 88mm gun capable of dominating any open crossing. His presence was not symbolic. It defined the way of fighting for the entire offensive. The infantry accompanying those armored vehicles was trained to move with them, not behind them. Sappers were prepared to clear obstacles without halting the column, and sections were accustomed to advancing under fire and abandoning positions without consolidating them. They weren't expected to defend ground, they were expected not to slow down. Further north, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend fulfilled a different role. It was not designed to penetrate deeply, but to widen and hold its ground. Its men were younger, but their commanders had learned to fight under constant pressure in Normandy. The division combined Panther tanks with aggressive infantry, accustomed to close-quarters combat in towns and wooded areas. Its mission was to pin down the enemy, prevent them from regrouping, and absorb counterattacks while the main force advanced. The Hitler Youth did not expect a race westward. They expected continuous fighting, attrition, and head-on clashes. Their recent experience had hardened them in improvised defenses and local counterattacks. In the Ardennes, that translated into a clear function: to keep the enemy occupied, even at the cost of losing speed. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich operated further south in an intermediate and problematic role. It had experience, cohesion, and seasoned officers, but suffered from material and human attrition. Their Panthers and mechanized units were operational, although they lacked the logistical priority of the Leibstandarte. Their objective was to exploit secondary breaches and sustain the advance if the main push managed to break through. In practice, this put it in an awkward position. It had to advance far enough to avoid being exposed, but without the means to impose its own pace. Further back as a potential maneuver mass were the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. They were not expected to deliver the initial blow, but rather to exploit any openings in the front or to provide support if the offensive slowed. Their units were structurally complete, but limited in fuel and strategic mobility. They were forces of opportunity, not of initiative. Over all of them was the command of the 6th SS Panzer Army, headed by Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich knew he had no real reserves. The closed skies were as important as the King Tigers. The offensive was designed to move before the enemy could react en masse. The state of the troops reflected that urgency. There was no boisterous enthusiasm. There was concentration and a particular kind of professional resignation. The veterans knew there would be no second chance. The young replacements sensed the tension without fully understanding it. Nobody was talking about holding positions. They were talking about crossings, kilometers, and hours. When the columns began to move toward their starting points, it wasn't just a single unit that was moving, but an entire system designed to break through. Each SS division had a precise function within that system. Some had to run, others resist, others continue if the path opened up. Nothing was decided yet. But everything the Reich could still concentrate in the west was there, lined up on forest roads, engines dormant, waiting for the signal. The advance would not be a series of isolated battles. It would be a continuous test of whether that force, with those men and those resources, could still set the pace in a war that no longer waited for anyone. The first clash of Hitler's devils. On the American side, the first indication wasn't a visible attack, but a loss of coherence. At battalion command posts, the telephones stopped answering almost simultaneously. Operators switched to radio and found the air saturated with overlapping transmissions. At 5:30 a.m., several companies reported heavy movement without being able to specify direction or magnitude. The alerts came out fragmented. Each unit described its own problem, without a unified picture. In the sectors covered by the 99th Infantry Division, forward positions began to come under pressure from axes that were not initially considered priorities. Platoons armed with M1 Garand rifles, .30 caliber Browning machine guns, and bazookas attempted to engage targets at close range. On narrow roads, the first anti-tank shot was sometimes enough to stop a light vehicle. Against King Tigers, the shells ricocheted or exploded without decisive effect. The reaction was almost automatic: fall back to the next bend, buy seconds, fire again. At Honsfeld, an American section attempted to hold a crossing with 2 machine guns and a 57mm anti-tank gun. The weapon fired from close range, damaging a support vehicle and forcing the German infantry to dismount. Minutes later, the gun was neutralized by direct fire. The crossing was opened. The withdrawal was made on foot through the snow, abandoning heavy ammunition to gain speed. The first formal alerts reached the higher ranks belatedly. In regimental barracks, maps began to fill with pencil markings, short arrows, question marks, marginal notes. One message spoke of an advance along a secondary road, another of contact in a town not included in the defensive plans. The orders issued instructed units to hold their positions when, in practice, they could no longer do so. At Lanzerath, a small detachment held out for hours from elevated positions. Armed with rifles, a single machine gun, and limited ammunition, they stopped vehicles and forced the attacking infantry to deploy. This delay allowed nearby units to prepare demolitions and alert the rear. The cost was high. As evening fell without enough ammunition, the defenders withdrew along secondary routes divided into small groups. In other areas, the response was improvised. Officers assembled ad hoc groups of cooks, drivers, and supply personnel armed with whatever was available. Roadblocks were erected using trucks placed across the road and anti-tank mines laid by hand. Some held for minutes, others collapsed at the first contact with heavy armor. The objective was not to win, but to delay. Communications to the west became congested. Artillery units attempted to provide indirect fire support, but a lack of observers and fog reduced their effectiveness. In several instances, batteries fired interdiction blasts onto suspected roads without visual confirmation. The explosions did not halt the advance, but they forced diversions that consumed time and fuel. Air support never arrived. Requests piled up unanswered because the airfields were shrouded in fog. This absence was a recurring theme in every report. No fighter bombers, no reconnaissance. Ground defense was left to fend for itself, sustained by small arms and local decisions. As the day progressed, the reports became more precise and more serious. There were talks of heavy vehicles, long columns of traffic, and crossings lost in minutes. The tone changed. No longer were they asking for confirmation, but for restraint. Partial withdrawals were ordered to avoid encirclement. Some companies withdrew at the right moment. Others were overwhelmed and scattered into the forest. As night fell, the American forces continued fighting, but their lines were disorganized. There were pockets of staunch resistance and others that had given way without prolonged combat. Weapons lay abandoned in ditches, and positions continued firing, unaware that the front had shifted back kilometers. Reorganization began immediately, closing off strategic routes, erecting new roadblocks, and holding out until reinforcements arrived. That day wasn't lost because of a single action, but because of the accumulation of isolated decisions made under pressure. With incomplete information and without air support, the defense reacted, fought, and delayed. It also remained open. And on the roads of the Ardennes, that difference was measured in hours. Close-range fights in the Belgian forests. For the SS commanders in the vanguard, the second day was perceived as a loss of momentum, not a formal halt. In internal reports, the word that is repeated is not defeat, but stall. A mechanized infantry officer from the Leibstandarte recorded that the advance continued, but in fragments, with units reaching key crossroads without knowing what was happening 2 kilometers ahead. In the armored columns, the feeling was palpable. A King Tiger driver described how, after advancing for hours at night, the tank came to a halt on a sharp bend near the Amblève, with 2 other vehicles blocking the way. The engine was still running to prevent it from stalling in the cold. Fuel consumption was soaring. The crew had been on duty for over 18 hours without rest. The order was to wait and cover the exit with the gun pointed at an empty street. There was no fighting at that point for hours, only sustained tension. The SS infantry operating on foot registered a different perception. A non-commissioned officer from the 1st Panzergrenadier Regiment wrote that the enemy no longer fled immediately, but appeared in small, well-positioned groups, fired and withdrew. This forced the deployment of men to clear flanks, reducing the number available to continue advancing. Every crossing one required staying put, and staying put was the opposite of the original plan. At Stavelot, SS sappers recounted crossing the bridge under intermittent fire. It wasn't a massive frontal assault, but rather a layered operation. First infantry securing approaches, then engineers inspecting loads, and finally the tanks crossing one by one. One testimony mentions the sound of metal flexing under the weight of the King Tiger tanks and the explicit order not to stop in the middle of the bridge under any circumstances. Peiper's reports reflect growing frustration with uncombated delays, roads blocked by damaged vehicles, poorly marked detours, columns taking the wrong routes and having to turn back. In one documented case, a Panther section travelled more than 12 kilometres along a secondary road only to find an unusable bridge and retrace their steps, losing half a day without firing a shot. The feeling of isolation appears in several accounts. An SS liaison officer noted that at certain times the vanguard had no reliable contact with the immediate rear. Radios worked erratically in the wooded terrain. Maps did not reflect the rapid changes on the front. Orders arrived late or became irrelevant within hours. The weather, which had protected the initial advance, began to become an ambiguous factor. The fog continued to hinder Allied air support, but it also caused disorientation. A company commander noted that landmarks were disappearing and that towns were becoming indistinguishable from one another. Entering the wrong town meant losing fuel, being exposed to fire from houses, and having to retreat under pressure. Among the troops, fatigue became evident. Soldiers who had advanced on foot alongside the armoured vehicles since dawn began to fall behind. Rations were consumed irregularly. In several places, the infantry relied on captured food. It wasn't a crisis yet, but the strain was accumulating. What stands out most in the SS testimonies from this period is not intense combat, but a sense of contained urgency. They knew they were advancing within the enemy lines, that every hour counted, and that time was no longer entirely on their side. One officer summed up the situation with a terse phrase: "We kept advancing, but the advance was no longer ours." Thus, the clash escalated without resolution. The SS maintained pressure, seized crossroads, and continued to push forward, but each advance demanded more men, more fuel, and more time. The initial momentum had not been exhausted, but it was being eroded by a rapidly learning resistance and by terrain that showed no mercy. The offensive continued, but it no longer advanced in a straight line. It advanced through sheer persistence, and that difference was beginning to show in every report, every testimony, and every crossing, one at a greater cost than the last. US responses to SS pressure. On the American side, the reaction ceased to be improvisation and became a selective strategy. By the second day, they were no longer talking about isolated contacts, but about compromised routes. In regimental command posts, maps were cleaned and remarked. Fewer arrows, more crosses. The order was simple: deny passage, halt columns, and hold out as long as possible. Not defend everything, defend what mattered. As they approached Trois Ponts, an artillery officer gave the order without observers. The 105mm guns began pounding the road, curve after curve. For more than an hour, shells exploded on access roads and snow-covered embankments. They didn't destroy entire columns, but they forced them to halt. SS drivers reported nearby explosions, scattered vehicles, and confused orders. The advance continued, but time was running out. At Stoumont, the German vanguard was pinned down for much of the day. Bazookas fired from basements, wooded edges, and even backyards were key, as an ammunition depot was nearby. One American soldier recalled firing from less than 40 meters, seeing the impact and running without looking back. They weren't trying to confirm targets. They were trying to survive and buy time. Allied communications improved. The messages were now clear: heavy tanks confirmed, main axis compromised, priority bridges. Engineers waited with detonators ready. At a secondary crossing, the bridge was blown up just as the first SS armored vehicles were in sight. The blast blocked the road. An entire column had to be diverted, adding kilometers and wasting fuel. On the SS side, the advance became a series of interruptions. One Panther commander wrote that his section spent the day advancing 100 meters, waiting 20 minutes, then advancing again. The enemy would appear, fire, and disappear. There was no line to break. Every village demanded combat. Every forest concealed an anti-tank gun. An infantry officer described the capture of a small town under fire from windows and barns. Grenades, short bursts, forced doors, less than an hour of fighting. Enough to leave wounded, and a section behind to secure the place. That pattern repeated itself time and again. Advancing meant leaving men behind. Leaving men behind weakened the push. Fatigue began to take its toll. King Tiger crews reported more than 24 hours without any real rest. The cold forced them to keep the engines running. Fuel was still sufficient, but there was no longer any to spare. Every stop was discussed over the radio. Every deviation strained the pilots. On the American side, small armored detachments began to appear. 2 or 3 medium tanks were enough to block a route for hours. They would fire from a distance, withdraw, and reappear at another intersection. One commander summed it up like this: hit and run. It worked. A new perception emerged in the SS testimonies. The enemy was learning. What had been an immediate retreat on the first day was now resilient resistance. One non-commissioned officer wrote, "We were no longer advancing on empty positions, but on decisions." That sentence marked the turning point. As night fell, both sides had adjusted their tactics. The Americans were no longer seeking a continuous front. They were trying to strangle the advance. The SS continued to push forward, but every kilometer consumed their advantage. The offensive hadn't stopped, nor had it broken. The fight was no longer about territory, but about time. A bridge blown up, a defended crossing, a column halted. In the Ardennes, each local scene began to outweigh any overall plan. The open corridor was closing, meter by meter, without a decisive blow, but with a wear and tear that could no longer be ignored. Joachim Peiper. Command under pressure, isolated columns and decisions with no room for ground. For Joachim Peiper, that phase of the battle wasn't measured in kilometers gained, but in orders that ceased to have any effect. His command post advanced and retreated with the column, set up in requisitioned houses, empty schools, or half-collapsed barns. Maps were updated by hand. References became outdated within hours. Information arrived in fragments. A damaged bridge here, a closed road there, a section stopped due to lack of fuel further back. Communications were sporadic. At various times throughout the day, Peiper had partial contact with the vanguard and almost none with support elements. The messages described brief advances followed by lengthy halts. One column reported having covered barely 2 kilometers in 3 hours due to successive roadblocks. Another requested instructions on how to bypass a recently demolished structure without knowing if the detour was passable for the King Tiger tanks. The American pressure felt like a slow, tightening pincer movement. It wasn't a frontal counterattack, but rather carefully chosen blockades. At the approaches to Stoumont and Gleize, reports described accurate fire from commanding positions, shots that forced infantry deployments and, above all, mounting delays. Peiper noted that the advance was still happening, but that each crossing required men he could no longer replace. The fuel problem became critical. Although the captured tanks had allowed them to continue, actual consumption exceeded initial estimates. A stationary King Tiger with its engine running was consuming hundreds of liters without making any progress. Peiper received reports of crews rationing their movements, shutting down engines in exposed positions and restarting them at the risk of not making it. Every decision to wait had an immediate cost. The sky began to clear intermittently, and with it came a new threat. Although the Allied Air Force had not yet launched a full-scale attack, the possibility altered their behavior. The columns dispersed, concealed themselves under groves of trees, and slowed their speed. Peiper understood that the time for advancing in broad daylight without punishment was running out. The clock, already ticking, began to tick even faster. From his position, Peiper assessed options that weren't in the original plan. Continuing to push west meant leaving behind damaged vehicles, exhausted infantry, and unsafe routes. Halting to reorganize meant losing the initiative altogether. Reports from subordinate units spoke of isolation, of men fighting without knowing what was happening in the next town. Meanwhile, the Americans were tightening their encirclement. Peiper received reports of new armored forces appearing at crossings that had been clear just hours before. The gunfire wasn't aimed at destroying their tanks immediately, it was intended to force them to stay put. Every hour lost reduced the psychological distance to the encirclement. Peiper's character appears in SS testimonies as that of a commander constantly on the move, attempting to maintain cohesion where the terrain and the enemy were eroding it. One officer recalled seeing him personally review routes, argue with sappers about the feasibility of a diversion, and cut short conversations to take urgent calls. There was no long-term planning, there was continuous crisis management. By the end of that day, the situation was clear to him, even if it wasn't yet visible on the major maps. The offensive had lost its ability to expand. The Americans hadn't stopped the column with a decisive blow, but they were encircling it through attrition. Fuel, the skies, and the roads were no longer on their side. This is the point at which the war of movement transforms, for Peiper, into a war of forced choice, deciding what to maintain, what to abandon, and how far to push without destroying his own force. The next step will no longer be to advance faster, but to survive the encirclement that is beginning to take shape around his column. At Gleize, the advance shrinks until it is trapped. The movement eventually collapsed at a single point. The roads that had allowed them to advance began to close one by one, not with a clean blockade, but with successive denials. Peiper's column stretched out and then compressed until it was concentrated around Gleize, a small town with narrow streets, incapable of absorbing a heavy armored force for long. The arrival at Gleize was not a planned decision. It was a consequence. The approaches to the west were under intermittent fire. To the north, the crossings appeared blocked by recent demolitions. To the south, the detours proved impassable for the King Tigers, with secondary bridges unable to support their weight. Every attempt to resume the advance was met with an immediate response. Gunfire from the air, interdiction artillery, small groups appearing and disappearing. Within the town, the concentration of vehicles became visible. More than 30 vehicles, carts, half-tracks, trucks were scattered throughout the streets and yards, seeking cover where none existed. The crews shut off their engines to conserve fuel and restarted them only when given a specific order. The silence was tense. Exhaust fumes mingled with the steam of breath in the cold. The Americans adjusted their pressure. They didn't launch an immediate frontal assault. They closed off exits, such as the approaches to Stoumont and to the west, and positioned anti-tank guns and artillery with forward observers. Every attempt to break out was met with accurate fire. One American commander described the tactic as making them feel the limit. It wasn't about driving them out at that moment, but about convincing them that there was no way out. The sky ultimately shifted the balance. With more frequent breaks in the clouds, Allied aircraft began to appear in sectors. It wasn't a continuous attack, but it was enough to force vehicles to take cover and halt all daytime movement. A single aircraft was enough to paralyze an entire street. The King Tigers, fearsome on the ground, became immobile targets when exposed. Fuel became the dominant problem. Reports spoke of vehicles with less than a quarter of a tank, empty trucks and engines that couldn't stay running. Peiper received reports of crews who could no longer maneuver without risking being permanently stranded. The convoy had advanced to the limit of its range. Inside Gleize, the SS infantry deployed to hold an improvised perimeter. Positions were established on the edges of the village, automatic weapons covered the roads, and sappers prepared charges to destroy equipment if necessary. The fighting was close and fragmented. Isolated shots, night patrols, and American attempts to close in to observe and adjust their fire. Peiper evaluated options with minimal margin. Holding the position meant consuming resources that could not be replenished. Attempting a breakout during the day exposed the tanks to air attacks. Doing so at night required abandoning vehicles that could no longer move. Each alternative involved losses. There was no solution that would preserve the force intact. On the American side, the perception was different. Reports spoke of a contained, visible enemy force becoming less active over time. The orders were clear: maintain the siege, avoid unnecessary risks, wait. Time now was on the side of the defense. Gleize thus became an undeclared endpoint. The advance, which had begun as a race across crossings and rivers, ended confined to a small urban area, where the firepower of the armored vehicles no longer offered a decisive advantage. The offensive had not ended in a spectacular clash, but in a gradual stalemate. The next step would no longer be to advance or resist indefinitely. It would be to decide what to save when movement ceased to be an option. When the Devils fled, the fall of the Western Front. Throughout the Ardennes, other SS units continued fighting in simultaneous engagements, each with its own logic of attrition. No clear second axis or parallel breakthrough emerged to relieve the pressure on Peiper. What did appear was a constellation of short fronts, defended villages, contested crossroads, forests turned into traps. Each engagement consumed men, ammunition, and time, but none opened the path the plan required. To the north, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend clashed with an American defense that had already learned to yield without being destroyed. In towns near Butgenbach, attacks were launched against deep, staggered positions designed to absorb the blow and return it in fragmented bursts. The SS infantry advanced street by street, supported by Panther tanks that maneuvered with difficulty among houses, walls, and destroyed vehicles. Crossfire forced them to halt, deploy, and clear. Every advance was measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. The Americans responded with a precise combination: well-camouflaged 76mm cannons, bazookas in corners and basements, and machine guns covering predictable exits. A company report described how a Panther tank was hit on the flank at close range, came to rest across the main street, and blocked the column's advance. The SS infantry had to advance without armored support, house by house, under constant fire. By nightfall, the tank was abandoned. There was no general retreat. There was a slow accumulation of losses. Further south, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich advanced along secondary routes with similar difficulties. At Mannheim, a well-timed American counterattack blocked the advance for hours. The Panthers were forced to deploy in open terrain, without urban cover, just as Allied artillery was rapidly adjusting its fire. An SS officer noted that the enemy was no longer defending by instinct, but by calculation. The advance continued, but without momentum, without surprise. The columns of Das Reich began to fall into disarray. Forward units called for reinforcements that couldn't arrive due to blocked or raided roads. The distance between the front and rear stretched dangerously. At one point, a section was isolated for an entire night without radio contact, holding an improvised position with limited ammunition. At dawn, it withdrew, leaving behind heavy weapons and immobilized vehicles. The map was filling with gaps. In the St. Vith sector, the fighting took on a different character. There, American forces defended the road junction with a tenacity that forced the SS to commit resources to a point not intended as decisive. Successive attacks with infantry and armored vehicles met with unyielding positions. The result was an operational gridlock. Units pinned down where they shouldn't have been, consuming the margin that the original plan could not afford to lose. Further south still, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions advanced with increasing caution. They sought to exploit opportunities that never fully materialized. They encountered blown-up roads, bridges unable to withstand the weight of the King Tiger tanks, and detours that forced long night marches. The infantry grew weary. The columns stretched out. Contact with the enemy was intermittent, but enough to deny speed and continuity. On the American side, the defense became mobile and deliberate. Small armored forces would appear at critical intersections, fire and withdraw before being engaged. One commander recalled that his unit moved 3 times in a single day, closing different routes for brief periods. No blockade was permanent, all were costly. Each one added minutes, fuel and fatigue to the German tally. Allied artillery became a constant backdrop. With improved communications and forward observers, fire was concentrated on predictable routes, not visible concentrations. Some roads began to be avoided not because they were destroyed, but because they were always under fire. This further reduced movement options and compressed columns into increasingly vulnerable spaces. The weather finally tipped the scales. With the improvement in the weather, Allied aircraft entered the fray. They didn't destroy entire columns immediately. They disrupted the advance. A single attack was enough to paralyze a route for hours. Vehicles scattered under the trees, movements were postponed until nightfall, orders were delayed. The offensive lost its daytime continuity, one of its few initial strengths. In the SS testimonies from these sectors, a common pattern appears. There was no point where the front broke, but neither was there one where it could stabilize. Every advance met with calculated resistance. Every resistance produced attrition. The original plan, designed to string together rapid successes, fragmented into local battles without strategic resolution. At the end of this phase, the SS were still fighting at multiple points, but they no longer dictated the pace. The distributed and persistent American pressure had achieved the essential goal, transforming the offensive into a series of tactical problems. Peiper was pinned down. Other units were making little or no progress. The war continued, but its meaning had changed. What had begun as a bid to break through the front had become a struggle to avoid being trapped in too many places at once. And in the Ardennes, that kind of fight is rarely won with heavy armor, ambitious plans, and an offensive that had already lost its initial momentum. At Bastogne, the 101st and the town that saved the United States. Bastogne became central even before the first shot was fired. Not because of its size or population, but because everything converged there. 7 main roads wound in and out of the town like taut nerves. In terrain where the forest closed off options and ice punished any detour, Bastogne offered continuity. For an offensive that depended on advancing without pause, denying this would have meant crippling the entire system. The Americans understood in time, but barely. The first units to arrive found neither fortifications nor a finished plan. They found minutes. Trucks stopped in snow-covered ditches and unloaded men without ceremony. The 101st Airborne Division deployed toward the edges of the town, occupying isolated farms, forest clearings, and secondary access roads. They dug with short shovels, wearing hard hats with numb hands. The positions weren't deep, but they were repetitive. A pit here, another 100 meters away, another covering an invisible bend. The preparation was functional, not showy. Browning .30 and .50 caliber machine guns were positioned to sweep approaches. Bazookas were distributed in pairs and concealed in cellars, fences, and stables. The 105mm guns were aimed at likely roads using improvised firing tables. A continuous wall was not the goal. Overlap was the objective. Fire, move, fire again from a different angle. The city was organized into sectors. Each unit knew which roads couldn't be compromised, even if they were unaware of what was happening 2 kilometers ahead. Night patrols walked routes in silence, counted curves, memorized tree names. A soldier would later recall that the map was of little use. What was important was recognizing the sound of each road under the snow. Visibility was deceiving. So was the silence. Within the perimeter, logistics were adjusted to the reality of the approaching encirclement. Ammunition was rationed from the start. Rations were served cold. The wounded were concentrated in sturdy buildings far from windows. There was no expectation of immediate relief. The plan was to hold out. The message circulated without the need for written orders. Hold, don't go looking for a fight. Outside, the German movement was perceived as flanking pressure, not a frontal assault. Patrols appeared at the edges of the woods, firing tentative shots, mortars testing response times. From a distance, engines could be heard starting and stopping. The SS columns did not launch immediately. They measured their approach. Bastogne demanded infantry, coordination, and increasingly scarce ammunition, especially rockets. Allied reports began to confirm the presence of Panthers covering access points and the possibility, if entry was forced, of engaging King Tigers in an unfavorable environment. Narrow streets, tight turns, stone buildings. The calculation was simple. On the open road, the heavy armor commanded respect. Inside the village, they became rigid. The weather continued to darken the sky. The fog both protected and isolated. Radios worked erratically. Messages were repeated to confirm reception. Each returning patrol brought minimal but crucial information. Movement east, fresh tracks, engine south. Bastogne was beginning to take shape in the minds of those defending it more than on any map. Meanwhile, the strategic maneuver was already underway. From the south, the US Third Army was beginning its turn. It wasn't yet felt in Bastogne, but it was expected. That expectation shaped the defense, holding out for hours, then days. Every road denied was a bridge to relief. Thus, by the time the Germans had finished closing off access points and adjusting their fire, Bastogne was no longer a surprise. It was a prepared entanglement held together by overlapping positions, exhausted men, and a simple idea: do not advance, hold your ground. The ensuing battle would not begin with a sudden breakthrough, but with the clash between an offensive that needed to get through and a defense that had decided to stay put. The attack on Bastogne. In the southeastern sector, elements of the Panzergrenadier Regiment of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, advanced along the Neffe Road with a specific mission: to break through the perimeter and create a wedge that would allow them to explode toward the center. The infantry deployed in short lines, spaced 40 to 60 meters apart, using ditches, hedges, and field edges for cover. The attack began with hand-adjusted 81mm mortars. The shells landed close, kicking up snow and frozen ground. The first contact was immediate. Browning 30 caliber machine guns opened fire from staggered positions. The Germans threw themselves to the ground. One group managed to reach a farmhouse on the edge of the village. There they were pinned down by crossfire from 2 directions. No one advanced, no one retreated. The assault stalled. At nightfall, the unit withdrew, leaving wounded behind and having gained no more than 200 meters. Further east, a company of the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, attempted to advance through a snowy clearing leading to a secondary road. Reconnaissance had underestimated the defenses. As the infantry crossed the field, 2 bazookas fired from a short flank. They didn't destroy any armor, there wasn't any. But they halted the advance of captured trucks and gave away positions. The German response was immediate. Grenades, automatic fire from a dozen machine guns belonging to the heavy company. The American response came seconds later, 105mm artillery raining down on the starting line. The retreat was orderly, but with a loss of cohesion. The message was clear. There were no easy gaps. To the northeast, patrols from the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, infiltrated at night to cut cables and mark targets. In a wooden enclosure, the 2 sides met less than 20 meters apart. Grenades, short bursts of gunfire, voices in the darkness. The German patrol withdrew, leaving deep tracks in the snow and scattered shell casings. The objective was only partially achieved. At dawn, the Americans re-established communications. The Panthers played a specific and limited role. At the entrance to Marvi, 2 tanks positioned themselves on a dominant curve and fired high explosive rounds at the edges of the town. Then they withdrew before locking onto their positions. The effect was immediate, both psychological and tactical. For hours, no one left via that route. But the perimeter remained closed. Within the town itself, the narrow streets and the bazookas kept them out. The King Tigers remained in the immediate rear. They covered sorties and deterred counterattacks. Their weight and turning radius made them unsuitable for entering Bastogne. When one tried to get closer than planned, it got stuck in a soft section. The recovery took hours and consumed fuel. The incident sealed the decision not to push them into the village. Within the perimeter, the 101st Airborne Division defended in layers. At Marvi, one section fired from basements and low walls, withdrawing after each exchange to avoid being located by mortar fire. At Foy, night patrols detected advances and called for interdiction fire on specific roads. The result was not destruction, but halting. In the center, artillery fire was directed along predictable axes, forcing the attackers to change routes repeatedly. The German problems accumulated without erupting into a visible crisis. There was insufficient infantry for a sustained assault. Each attempt consumed resources disproportionately, and pressure had to be maintained on other sectors. An SS company commander noted that each attack required reinforcements that could not arrive without opening other flanks. Bastogne demanded patience, and the offensive demanded speed. When the weather began to clear, the equation changed. Daytime movements decreased. Attacks were concentrated on increasingly shorter nights. The Americans received air resupply. It didn't solve everything, but it allowed them to continue. Ammunition was no longer the immediate bottleneck. The outcome of those days was unequivocal on the ground. The SS attacked at multiple points with different units, varied methods, and sustained courage. They did not break through. Each attempt yielded an operational lesson. The perimeter absorbed blows, the defense learned quickly, and time ran out. Bastogne didn't fall because there wasn't a single point to bring down. There was a net, and that net turned every assault into friction. Thus, the battle at Bastogne was defined less by the violence of a single attack than by the sum of failed attempts. For the SS, it was the point where the offensive began to pay off. For the defenders, it was the point at which resistance ceased to be a slogan and became a method. The pattern turned when the front changed direction. At the headquarters of the US Third Army on the night of December 18th, the German offensive was no longer a surprise, nor was it contained. The salient was growing, Bastogne was cut off, and the Allied front continued to look east, facing an enemy now pushing from a different angle. The decision was radical, to turn the entire army around, not a division, not a corps, the entire Third Army. A nearly 90-degree change of direction in the dead of winter, with icy roads, overcrowded columns, and logistics designed for advancing in the opposite direction. Patton didn't ask for authorization for the turn, he asked for time. The order was direct. The units marching toward Germany were to turn around and advance toward Bastogne. The first to receive it were those already on the move. The 4th Armoured Division changed course in the early hours of the 19th. Its columns halted at rural crossroads where there were no signs or clear maps, only barns, fences, and bare trees. Traffic officers improvised detours with covered flashlights. At some points, the vehicles turned one by one on the ice, pushed by hand to avoid getting stuck across the road. The distance was considerable, between 120 and 160 kilometers, depending on the starting point. The allotted time was minimal. The columns advanced at night to avoid traffic congestion and air attacks, although the skies remained overcast and during the day when there was no other option. The engines were shut down only when absolutely necessary. When they stopped, restarting them was difficult. The oil was thick, the batteries were weakened, the brakes seized up. Some vehicles were abandoned, not due to enemy fire, but because of mechanical failures that were impossible to repair at that time. The turn toward the combat zone wasn't straightforward. The roads were congested in both directions, retreating units, wounded, artillery moving, engineers searching for intact bridges. In some sections, advancing 10 kilometers took hours. Even so, the movement didn't stop. Orders traveled by radio and messengers. If a unit couldn't follow its assigned route, it took another. The priority wasn't the route, it was the direction. The first contact with German forces came before Bastogne. In the Ardennes sector, American patrols clashed with advanced elements covering the flanks of the salient, infantry supported by anti-tank guns. The 4th Armoured Division responded with direct fire and accompanying artillery. The fighting was brief but significant. For the first time since the start of the offensive, the Germans were encountering organized pressure from the south. This shift began to appear in German reports. Intercepted messages and operational logs mention unexpected enemy armored forces and increasing activity on the southern flank. For the SS, already worn down and running low on fuel, this new front meant dividing their efforts. Every company sent south was one less to pressure Bastogne or hold critical routes. Meanwhile, other units of the Third Army continued their advance. The 26th Infantry Division moved forward along secondary roads, undertaking forced marches of more than 30 kilometers a day in extreme conditions. The 81st Division secured crossings and covered flanks, freeing the armored units to advance. There was no pre-assembly. The attack was built on the move. By December 22nd, the vanguard elements were already fighting less than 25 kilometers from Bastogne. At that point, the turning point ceased to be an abstract maneuver and became perceptible to the defenders. From within the perimeter, the sound of artillery fire to the south, distinct from the SS attacks, was clearly distinguishable. It wasn't immediate relief, it was orientation. For Peiper and other SS commanders, Patton's change of course disrupted the operational logic. Until then, the problem had been advancing without sufficient fuel. Now another problem arose: protecting the escape routes. Reports mention the need to keep certain routes open at any cost, even when those routes no longer led to the original objective, but rather to avoiding encirclement. The weather began to clear intermittently. It wasn't a complete break, but it was enough for Allied aircraft to begin operating in sectors. The German columns were more exposed. The American columns to the south were better coordinated. The ground shift and the partial clearing of the skies reinforced each other. The final advance towards Bastogne was not a frontal assault. It was constant pressure, occupation of villages, expulsion of SS detachments incapable of holding positions without support. Every kilometer gained reduced the German margin. Every crossing captured forced a retreat. On December 26th, when the first elements of the 4th Armoured Division reached the perimeter and made contact, the turning point was complete. The Battle of the Bulge was not over. But the phase in which the German offensive dictated the pace was over. Patton's turn was not decisive in itself. It did not destroy the SS nor immediately close the salient, but it changed the geometry of the front. It transformed a deep offensive into a problem of retreat. Bastogne ceased to be an isolated point and became the center of a convergence. From that moment on, the question was no longer how much further the SS could advance. It was how long they could hold on before the front, turned and compressed, finally closed in on them. Clear skies in the Ardennes. Allied aircraft arrive. The morning the sky cleared brought not silence but another sound. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the skies, was as absent as German fuel depots. There was no defense, no planes with swastikas in the sky. If anything flew, it was the enemy. Soon, an unrelenting drone began to be heard. For the Waffen-SS units in the Ardennes, that noise marked a turning point. Several accounts concur. Untersturmführer Karl-Heinz Becker of the Leibstandarte would later write, "Until then, we feared the enemy in front of us. That day, we began to fear the sky." The first to appear were the P-47 Thunderbolt. Low, heavy, with external fuel tanks dangling and rockets under their wings, they didn't approach like agile fighters but like flying hammers. From the cockpit, the pilots searched for movement. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a pilot with the 61st Fighter Squadron, described the Ardennes from the air as a map that drew itself, black roads on white snow, every fresh track was an invitation. The German columns, forced to use predictable routes, were exposed as if advancing on a sand table. The first passes were strafing runs. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns swept the highway from side to side. Trucks exploded. Half-tracks were left stranded. Men jumped into ditches. A single pass was enough to set a tanker ablaze or block an intersection for hours. Then came the 127mm rockets, flying with a loud whistling sound. Not all of them hit. They didn't need to. The goal wasn't to destroy everything, but to stop everything. A rocket falling nearby was enough to disperse a column, shut down engines, and break the rhythm. Around mid-morning, the P-38 Lightnings joined the fray, operating at higher altitudes and coordinated with forward observers. They repeatedly made passes over the same areas as if marking their territory. And shortly afterwards, the British Typhoons appeared with their 4 20mm cannons, punishing forest exits and villages where the vehicles were trying to hide. On the German side, the reaction was immediate and revealing. Total dispersion order. The vehicles were hidden under the trees. They were covered with branches and tarpaulins. The engines were turned off for hours, even in sub-zero temperatures. In several cases, the King Tigers remained motionless in ditches or secondary roads. Moving them would have given away their position. Oberfeldwebel Hans Roth, a King Tiger II crewman from the 501st Heavy Battalion, would recall, "We spent 6 hours inside the tank, without moving, without smoking, without speaking. Every time we heard an engine above, we felt that the armor was useless." Flak's units went into action. The 20mm Flakvierlings with their 4 barrels opened fire in a fan pattern as the fighter bombers descended. The 37mm guns sought out longer-range targets with short, calculated bursts. Ammunition was limited. Every shot counted. In his memoirs, Wilhelm Küster, a flak gunner in the Ardennes, wrote, "We didn't fire to bring them down, but rather to force them up with a curtain of fire large enough that they would have to avoid us. But every time we fired, we knew they would come for us again. Those hours of daylight were hell when the gun overheated without being able to fire." And they were coming. The anti-aircraft positions became priority targets. A veteran of the Leibstandarte recounted that after shooting down a Thunderbolt, his battery was attacked minutes later by 4 more aircraft, rockets, explosions, 2 guns destroyed. Most of the crews were dead. Defending themselves from the air meant exposing themselves to the air. The air activity wasn't constant, but it was relentless. Waves in the morning, brief pauses, new appearances in the afternoon. Sometimes a single aircraft was enough to halt an entire column. Daytime movements virtually ceased. The German offensive, conceived as a continuous advance, was reduced to increasingly shorter nighttime raids. On the Allied side, coordination improved rapidly. A crossroads battered by artillery in the morning could be attacked from the air in the afternoon. Heavy armored vehicles weren't always destroyed, but the system would break down, burning fuel, exploding ammunition, routes blocked by charred wreckage. In Bastogne, the Air Force played another crucial role. C-47 Skytrains dropped containers of ammunition, food, and medicine over the perimeter. Sergeant Forrest Guth of the 101st Airborne would later recall, "Seeing those parachutes fall was the first time in days that we felt we weren't alone." The same fighter bombers that hours earlier had been strafing SS columns were now strafing positions near the encirclement, forcing them to disperse and reducing the pressure on the defenders. For the Waffen-SS, the sensation was new and suffocating. A non-commissioned officer in the Hitler Youth noted in his diary, "There was no longer a rear guard. The front was in front, behind and above. Every road, every clearing, every village could be observed and attacked. The Panthers and King Tigers, which had commanded respect in the early days, became static symbols, not due to technical incapacity, but due to the context. Moving them during the day was inviting an attack. Moving them at night was no longer enough to recover what had been lost. Allied air superiority alone did not destroy the Waffen-SS, but it did something more important. It robbed them of their freedom of maneuver, the central element of the entire offensive. From that moment on, the battle ceased to be a race for crossroads and depots. It became a fight for survival, to save men and equipment before the land and air blockade closed completely. The sky, which had been neutral for a week, entered the fray, and in the Ardennes, when the sky entered the fray, the German offensive lost its last refuge. The same fighter bombers that hours earlier had been strafing SS columns were now strafing positions near the encirclement, forcing them to disperse and reducing the pressure on the defenders. For the Waffen-SS, the sensation was new and suffocating. A non-commissioned officer in the Hitler Youth noted in his diary, "There was no longer a rear guard. The front was in front, behind and above. Every road, every clearing, every village could be observed and attacked. The Panthers and King Tigers, which had commanded respect in the early days, became static symbols, not due to technical incapacity, but due to the context. Moving them during the day was inviting an attack. Moving them at night was no longer enough to recover what had been lost. Allied air superiority alone did not destroy the Waffen-SS, but it did something more important. It robbed them of their freedom of maneuver, the central element of the entire offensive. From that moment on, the battle ceased to be a race for crossroads and depots. It became a fight for survival, to save men and equipment before the land and air blockade closed completely. The sky, which had been neutral for a week, entered the fray, and in the Ardennes, when the sky entered the fray, the German offensive lost its last refuge. The withdrawal and abandonment of the offensive. The retreat did not begin with a clear order. It began with the impossibility of advancing further. For the Waffen-SS in the Ardennes, the withdrawal was a series of local decisions made under constant pressure: insufficient fuel, closed roads, hostile skies, and fragmented units that could no longer sustain a coherent front. Around Gleize, the situation became stark. Reports spoke of tanks at a standstill with critically low fuel reserves. The King Tigers and Panthers that had established a presence days earlier were now stranded in yards, ditches, and town entrances. Starting their engines during the day would have attracted air attacks. Moving them at night would have required fuel that was no longer available. The crews received perfunctory orders: disable the equipment. Charges were placed on locks, engine blocks, and aiming systems. In some cases, gun barrels were jammed. In others, internal compartments were set ablaze. The nighttime explosions weren't meant to be completely concealed. They were meant to end the attack. A non-commissioned officer recalled the sequence with mechanical precision: prepare, light the fuse, retreat without looking back. Each explosion was a lost asset and proof that the offensive had run its course. The withdrawal was done on foot in small groups without rigid formation. Routes were chosen for their silence, not their speed. Forests, frozen streams, and hedgerows were all part of the strategy. Heavy weapons were abandoned when they became an obstacle. Rifles, light machine guns, and minimal ammunition were retained. The wounded walked as long as they could. Those who couldn't were left in the care of comrades for as long as possible. The priority was no longer holding ground, but getting out of the salient. In other sectors, the withdrawal took different forms, but with the same result. Units of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, were ordered to retreat in stages, covering crossroads while other columns withdrew. Allied artillery bombarded predictable roads. Aircraft punished any daytime movement. The withdrawals were carried out at night with long pauses and short advances. Each dawn found the units immobilized and hidden. The problems multiplied. There was a lack of updated maps, radios with dead batteries, and officers unable to locate scattered subunits. In more than one instance, SS groups advanced onto routes that were already closed and had to retrace their steps, losing hours and men. Exhaustion was total. Rations had run out. The cold was taking its toll. The retreat wasn't a race. It was a fight against collapse. The destruction of equipment was not limited to tanks. Tankers, half-tracks, and flak guns were set on fire rather than left undamaged. At an intersection, an anti-aircraft battery that had repelled attacks for days was blown up by its own crew because it was impossible to move it without being detected. The retreat turned every stationary asset into a liability. On the Allied side, the pressure was constant and measured. The aim was not immediate annihilation, but rather to cut off exits and capture stragglers. American patrols found plumes of smoke marking abandoned positions. In towns, the wreckage of destroyed vehicles traced the path of the retreat. Aircraft continued to pound secondary routes, making even the nighttime withdrawal intermittent. In the end, what remained of the SS offensive was a fragmented retreat, with disproportionate material losses compared to direct combat. The heavy tanks, symbols of the initial push, were left behind by the dozens. The units retained men and experience, but lost operational capacity. When the salient finally closed, the Waffen-SS had indeed withdrawn, but they did so lighter and more exhausted, without the equipment that had made the advance possible. The Battle of the Bulge did not end that day, but the German offensive did. From that moment on, the Western Front ceased to be a battleground and became a terrain of containment and survival. The end of Hitler's dreams. When the last columns of the Waffen-SS finally managed to leave the salient, they did so without music or final gestures. They left behind empty villages, roads littered with debris, and a landscape marked by decisions made under duress. The American forces advanced methodically. They didn't pursue blindly. They secured their positions. Every recaptured crossing was inspected. Every village was cleared house by house. Every makeshift bridge was assessed before being allowed to pass. Engineers opened routes through debris and snow. Patrols collected straggling prisoners who had been left without unit or direction. At La Gleize, Stoumont, and the approaches to the valleys, the wreckage painted a clear picture. Where the advance had stalled, where a turn had been attempted, where the effort had been abandoned. The landscape was a stark reminder of the losses. King Tigers disabled with internal ammunition, Panthers abandoned in ditches, half-tracks burned to block roads, flak guns overturned and blown up by their own crews. It wasn't a theatrical battlefield, it was a map of irreplaceable material losses. The heavy tanks, symbols of the initial push, remained as motionless landmarks of a gamble that had run out of room to maneuver. For the Waffen-SS units that managed to withdraw, the return to shorter lines was immediate and harsh. They retained men, yes, but returned without the core that made a mobile offensive viable. Lost tanks were not replaced for weeks. Fuel remained a structural problem. Ammunition was rationed. The divisions shifted to a logic of active defense with reduced sectors, less mobility, and orders focused on containment, not maneuvering. In the Allied command posts, the reading was accurate. The immediate danger had passed. Bastogne was no longer an isolated enclave and was once again integrated into the communications network. The Third Army continued pushing to flatten the salient while other forces pressed from the north. The front regained continuity. The momentum shifted. The Air Force maintained the pressure. With clear skies, attacks targeted residual movements, makeshift depots and concentrations detected by reconnaissance. The German retreat lost flexibility even far from contact. Every attempt at reorganization was observed and punished. The air remained a limiting factor. But the closing of the salient was more than just regained territory. It was a loss of options. Operationally, it meant the end of Germany's last gamble in the West. There was no immediate capitulation or general collapse. There was a new certainty. There was no longer any room for strategic maneuvering that could alter the course of the war. The Ardennes were not the beginning of the end. They were the moment when the end became unavoidable. The consequences were quickly felt in the SS units. The Leibstandarte, Hitlerjugend, and Das Reich returned with experienced but worn-out command staffs and incomplete personnel. Time was spent rebuilding, redeploying, and filling gaps. Orders became defensive, reserves smaller, and sectors narrower. The offensive had demanded too much of a system that could no longer sustain it. On a human level, the retreat left less visible marks. Officers who had made decisions to abandon equipment lived with the weight of those orders. Crews who had blown up their own tanks returned on foot with light weapons and a weariness that couldn't be measured in days. The accumulated experience remained, but the confidence in the possibility of victory had changed. The war continued, yes, but with a different outlook. On the Allied side, the learning experience was different. The battle confirmed the effectiveness of joint arms coordination, ground, air, logistics, and command. It demonstrated the value of holding critical positions, Bastogne, while larger maneuvers were being reorganized. It reinforced an operational conviction. Denying the enemy mobility was as decisive as defeating them in direct combat. Victory was not a single event, it was a culmination of efforts. In the days that followed, the front stabilized and then advanced. Winter remained harsh, but the direction was no longer in dispute. The Ardennes lay behind as a final shock, a reminder that the enemy could still strike, but also proof that he could not sustain that blow. The strategic implications were clear. With the offensive exhausted, Germany lost personnel it could not replace. The West ceased to be a playing field and became an unavoidable line of defense. The Allied push towards the Rhine became a matter of timing, not possibility. For the Waffen-SS, the retreat marked the end of an era. They didn't disappear, they changed roles, they defended, delayed, and resisted. But the age of bold advances was over. The decisions that had led to the Ardennes were left behind, along with the abandoned tanks in the valleys. Thus the episode concluded, not with a single scene or an instant victory, but with the accumulation of events that transformed an ambitious offensive into a definitive frontier. The terrain was marked, the units too. The road to Germany opened without major strategic upheavals. And in that subsequent silence, more than in any battle, what had happened became clear. The war continued, but no longer in the same way.